This talk is going to, in a sense, be about cognitive development. It's going to be about the relationship between this naive conception of time that we might have and the sort of like representational power of perception, the way that time is represented in perception. Okay. There seems to be something like a naive or folk or default conception of time. It's the sort of thing like, you're going to see this over and over again throughout this conference. That, after some sort of metaphysical or scientific reasoning, we come to this picture of time that's sort of like shocking in some way, right? The shockingness is because it sort of conflicts with this default way that we have about thinking about time. Now, there's been a lot of sort of X-Fi recently that tries to sort of like uncover the contours of this naive conception of time. There's trying to understand what sort of like ontological or metaphysical commitments the folk have when they think about time. Right? There's disagreement within that, but there's some aspect of our default conception that I really want to focus on, and that's this thing that I'm going to be calling linear time. Linear time, as I'm taking it, consists of three different claims, three different features. The first is that time is ordered. So these are aspects of this sort of naive. Time is ordered. The world seems to contain a single unified timeline along which events can be ordered in terms of earlier than, later than, or simultaneity relations. This timeline also seems to exhibit a number of interesting asymmetries. So there's causal asymmetries, causes seem to precede their effects. There's epistemic asymmetries. The way that we know about the future is different than the way we know about the past. And maybe as a consequence of these things, there's a number of sort of practical asymmetries. The sorts of decisions that we make now, we take them to influence the future in ways that they don't influence the past. Combine these three things together, and this is what I'm going to call linear time. Okay. So the question that I want to focus on here is what accounts for our having this naive conception? Where does this come from? This is where the question from cognitive development comes in. Okay. If you look at not just philosophers talking about this, but psychologists and neuroscientists talking about this, you'll find a very sort of common claim. And that's what Christoph Borel has called the dependency thesis. According to the dependency thesis, our understanding of linear time, so it's time as being linearly structured, depends on our capacities for episodic memory, mental time. So it's not just any sort of memory capacity, but it's our ability to be able to sort of recollect and relive our past experiences that supposedly grounds our ability to understand time as being linearly structured. Okay. Now, why might people hold this? There's an argument that you see over and over again in the literature that tries to establish the dependency thesis based on something about experience. And I'm giving this the label of the distinctiveness thesis. That somehow, in order to explain how we come to think about time in a certain way, we have to appeal to the right sort of experiences. And the right sort of experiences are only provided to us through episodic recollection. Perception, while it might provide us with some sort of experience or awareness of time, isn't doing it in the right sort of way. It's not giving you the right sort of awareness to ground that sort of understanding of time as being linearly structured. So, what I want to do here is show that this distinctiveness thesis is false. That time is presented to us as linearly structured in perception. So it's ordered, asymmetric, and I skipped a really important one. So I talked about order, I talked about asymmetry, I didn't talk about the present, right? So in this sort of like linear conception of time, the present is given this like special status. I'm not giving it any sort of like ontological weight or anything like that, like some sort of metaphysical debates might have. But the present serves as sort of like an inflection point for a number of these asymmetries. Right? It distinguishes those things that you can know in a certain way or causally intervene in a certain way from those things you can't know or causally intervene on. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to argue that perception presents us with time as being ordered, asymmetric, and gives a special role to the present. The consequence of this is not directly to say that the dependency thesis is false. I have other reasons for thinking that that thesis is false, but I'm not going to actually give them here. It's just that if someone wants to argue for the dependency thesis, they have to do it in another way that doesn't appeal to distinctiveness. Okay. So I only have a slide that gives like a rundown of the talk, but I forgot to put that in. So the way that the talk's going to go is I'm going to give a little bit more background in this literature of cognitive development. Then I'm going to look at a couple arguments. I think it's 3 arguments that try and argue for the dependency thesis on the basis of something like distinctiveness. And then once we have that on the table, I'm going to give you point to some features of our perception of time that I think underline those arguments and show that time is presented to us as linearly structured perception. All right. So a little bit more background. Lots of reasoning about cognitive development or the development of temporal cognition starts off with a common observation. It seems like children have a relative difficult time in performing well on tasks that require them to reason about time. And they also seem to exhibit difficulty in acquiring a mastery of temporal language. This is sort of a relative difficulty. They seem to find it much harder to acquire a mastery of temporal language compared to things like spatial, object, or number language. Now, this is extra surprising given the fact that in almost every spoken language, time is a really sort of common feature of that language, whether it's sort of explicit tense markers or there's just explicit words for time. Right? There's more of that than there is spatial language, numerical language, or object-based language. Right? So what explains this sort of developmental difficulty? In the literature, you find an extreme explanation of this. This is what I'm calling the extreme position. This is the sort of thing that you find in Neo-Worfians. You also find this in the work of Christoph Borel and Teresa Cormack. And the idea is that, look, what explains the difference between the development in these other domains versus development in the temporal domain is that perception provides us access to these other domains. Perception provides us access to space or objects or number or numerosity. Right? But perception doesn't provide you with any access to time. It's entirely devoid of temporal content. I'm not really going to address these views so much. I really want to focus on this moderate position. Okay. The moderate position also explains something about this developmental difficulty, but says, look, perception does provide you with some sort of awareness of time. It does represent time in some ways, right? Some features of time, but it's not representing the right sort of features. It's not presenting you with an awareness in the right way to ground this sort of cognitive development. Okay, so we're going to look at 3 arguments that adopt this sort of moderate position. And then, as I said, we're going to turn to look at some empirical facts about perception. Okay. So the first argument that we're going to look at comes from Dorothea Debus. I'm presenting her argument here in a way that sort of like preserves the structure of her argument, but it's entirely paraphrased, just because of the phrasing that she used. Difficult to square with some sort of Bedouin backgrounds that I have. So here's her argument for the dependency thesis. She says, for a subject to possess the concept of the past, so this general understanding of the past as being behind us in the unified timeline, it's necessary that the subject possesses the concept of a particular past event. For a subject to possess the concept of a particular past event, that subject must have episodic memories of particular past events. Therefore, a subject can only possess the concept of the past if she has some episodic memories of a particular past event. Clearly, all the work's happening in premise too, right? So what does she say in support of it? Well, it's this general experience condition that she gives. In order for a subject to possess the concept of a particular past event, it's necessary that the subject have experiences of particular past events. So, why does she think that it's only episodic recollection that provides you with that sort of experience? Well, here's Debus on perception. She said, perception is capable of presenting us with a succession of events, yet this entire succession is presented to us as present. You might think of this as like one of these articulations of the specious present view. There's a sort of like paradoxical thing about the specious present, where it's got some sort of like temporal breadth to it. It's able to present you with events as following after one another. But in some ways, all of that's now. Right? That's the way of characterizing the representational content of perception that Debus gives us. Perception provides us with an awareness of some temporal properties of succession, but not of others, pastness. And then she helpfully goes on to explain what would be needed for perception to present you with some event as being in the past. And she says it has to do with causal reasoning or some sort of understanding of the causal structure of the world. To possess the concept of a past event, someone must have an experience of some events as being outside of one's causal world. And she thinks that that's not found in perception. Okay. So we're going to revisit this in a few minutes. But that's one argument, right? You can see how you get dependency from this claim about this distinctive way time is presented to us through one faculty versus another. All right. Here's an argument from Janan Ismael. Got similar sort of vibe to the Debus argument. Perception, according to her, provides us with an awareness that the world is in flux, that the world at any given moment is changing. But similar to how Debus puts it, it's like this doesn't mark a distinction between past and present or future events. It's only memory that allows us to stitch together moments of experience to notice the linear and asymmetric structure of time. Why does she think it's memory that's required here? Well, memory allows us to do something that she describes as the identification of moments. Memory allows us to identify or re-identify moments in time as they move from the future to the present to the past. This identifiability of moments allows us to grasp the practical, causal, and epistemic asymmetries of time. Again, this is supposed to be some sort of shortcoming in the access to time that perception provides us. And then here's a slightly different style of argument you get from John Campbell. Right? It's not just memory that's required, but it's something about autobiographical narratives that's required for understanding of time as being linear. So he doesn't think that memories alone. You might have scattered memories, or you might have memories of some event in your past, but you don't quite know where that fits into your overall life story. But once you integrate this into your narratives, this is where you get this sort of awareness of time as being linearly structured. And you think this arises due to two principles of narrative construction. One's a causal reasoning principle, so causal influences go into the future. And the other one has to do with this assumption about the unity of the self. When you're constructing these autobiographical narratives, there's just one you, right? Whatever the sort of metaphysics of personal identity might tell you, right? There's just one you when you're constructing these narratives. And this one you has to trace a continuous spatio-temporal path through that narrative. So you combine these things together, and you get this idea of line of time being linearly structured, right? It's this unified timeline that moves in a certain direction. Okay. Those are the three arguments, and you can see that they all have this common core to them. There's some features of time that are present in our awareness of time through episodic memory that are absent in our perceptual capacities, right? And it's these elements that they think are unique to episodic memory that ground our understanding of time. So we're going to now turn to perception. One thing that you might have noticed in the arguments that I presented, or it might be a little bit clearer if you look at those original sources, is that the methods that they're using to try and investigate what the representational features of perception are have like a plural problem with that sentence. Introspection plays a special role for them, right? It's introspection that's somehow revealing how perception is presenting time to you. Now, you might think that introspection just isn't the best tool for this. In other areas of cognitive sciences, we don't often use introspection to try and tell us what are the sort of representational capacities of those mental faculty. It might have some sort of role, but you do something else. Probably more importantly, in this literature on temporal experience, you see various camps using introspective methods that just come to loggerheads, right? You have these Husserlians versus Jamesian sorts of accounts of temporal experience that seemingly disagree with one another, right? They're using these introspective methods, where do you go from there, right? So what I want to do here in this section is to try and uncover what the representational features of temporal perception are by looking at what perception is supposed to do. You can put this, if anyone here is familiar with the levels of explanation that you get from David Marr, we want to specify first, what is it that what do our perceptual capacities have to do for the organism, right? That this computational level of explanation, and then we're going to look at the particular ways that our perceptual systems do this. Right? And I think that's going to reveal something about the representational contents. Now, what is it that perception has to do for us? This actually came up a little bit in the first talk this morning. Perception has to facilitate what I've been calling temporal coordination. So as we navigate our world, we gather information about the timing of events that are happening around us through all of our different sensory systems. And we have to use this information to coordinate our behaviors and actions with the timings of those events. Right? You have to be able to cross the street, or if you ever try to dance or play music with someone, you're gathering information through all these different sensory systems to coordinate your behaviors with the timing of things around you. It's by trying to understand how the perceptual system does this that I think it undermines the distinctiveness. Okay, so in order to do this, so I'm going to try and show how perception gives you both, or all three, the ordered, asymmetric, and temporal for the I'm not going to say so much about this ordered feature. I've argued for this in a lot of my other work recently. Temporal perception starts as sort of an assortment of initially fragmented capacities. We have timekeeping mechanisms that are specialized for very specific sorts of temporal features in our environment. We have timekeeping mechanisms that are specific for specific time scales. We have timekeeping mechanisms that are specific for different modalities, like vision versus audition versus touch, so on and so on. We even have timekeeping mechanisms that are specialized for different types of temporal properties. So rhythmic ordering versus non-rhythmic ordering, durations versus rates, so on and so on. And you can see how these come apart through all sorts of different means of selective intervention. Right? It's subsequent processing that brings together and integrates these various fragmented timekeeping capacities into a unified timeline. And there's sort of introspective reasons for thinking this, but there's also the behavioral reasons, and I think clinical or neural evidence to support them. We can talk about this later in Q&A if you want, but I'm just going to pass on from this. We have reasons for thinking that perception presents us with time as being ordered. Now, we have to get this asymmetry stuff and the special role for the present. So in order to get that, to establish that, I'm going to point to two features of our capacity for temporal perception. And I think together, those get us those two features. All right. So the first thing that I want to point us to is a particular sort of perceptual illusion that I think a lot of people in this temporal perception literature are familiar with, this cutaneous rabbit illusion. Sometimes this is thought of as an instance of trajectory estimation in perception. This is going to get us to the conclusion that perception represents more than a single moment in time. So, we obviously can't do this here, but I'm going to touch my arm to try and illustrate what happens in this, right? So, with a cutaneous rabbit illusion, what happens is people will initially have 3 taps at their wrist, right? Just imagine that happening right now. 3 taps at the wrist, right? What do you experience? Well, yeah, people are doing this, right? You have 3 taps in one location. Okay. Interesting things happen when you have this sort of presentation of taps. So 3 taps at the wrist, equally spaced in time. 3 taps a couple centimeters up the arm, again, equally spaced out in time. And then another 3 taps at a third location, another couple centimeters up the arm. Now, the thing that's really cool about this sort of experiment is that subjects don't report having 3 sets of 3 taps in 3 locations. Instead, what they report is having an experience like this. This is where it gets this cutaneous rabbit name. They have this experience of this tap hopping up their arm. Okay. This is an instance of postdictive effects. Okay. When you had the first 3 taps, the perceptual system had no reason to sort of perceive this as a series of taps moving up the arm. It's only after the second set of taps begins and it's reinforced by the third set of taps that perception is given this evidence that it then reinterprets as, oh, look, there was this one thing moving up my arm. Right. Now, some interesting features about this. It's the taps will often extend beyond the location of the third set of taps, and often subjects will experience more than 9 taps. There will be, 11 or so taps that extend up a little bit further up the arm. Okay. Now, what does this show? Well, it's a certain sort of perceptual illusion. It's, in some sense, not a temporal illusion, because the person isn't misperceiving the timing of the taps. It's a spatial illusion. They're misperceiving the location of the taps. Right? But in order for this spatial illusion to take place, the perceptual system has to be representing how these taps unfold over time. The perceptual system has to be able to go back and rewrite the location of taps at earlier moments. Right? So at time 4, when you're having that first set of taps at the second location, right? The perceptual system is somehow able to go back and say that tap at time 2, that happened not where you initially thought it was, but it was a little bit further up the arm. And you do this over and over again, right? So the perceptual system has a way of keeping track of events in time, right, in order to rewrite where they occurred. Now, you might understand this, so this may be like a point of unclarity with Ismael's argument. Is this a re-identification of moments in time to say at a particular moment in time this event happened, or is it event-based by saying this event that happened at an earlier moment in time at a different location? Not clear exactly how to interpret these things, but nevertheless, there's some sort of re-identification of events at a particular point. Okay. Now, this just gets us the claim that perception represents distinct moments in time. That alone doesn't get you asymmetry or a special role for the present. So here's the second feature of our temporal perception that I want to focus on: the role of causal reasoning principles in temporal perception. As I said earlier, temporal perception is in some sense constructed. You start off with these initially fragmented timekeeping capacities, and something has to integrate them together. You might think that this is very similar to the sort of integration that you find in spatial cognition or spatial perception. So for those of you who are familiar with vision science from the 80s, you were supposedly confronted with the world, and then vision parsed that initial retinal signal into a feature map for colors, a feature map for shapes, a feature map for motion, and somehow you integrated these things together. What guided this integration? Well, some sort of commonality of objects across these. I think there's reasons for why that sort of story isn't going to work in the temporal domain. And instead of being an object-based integration process, it's event-based. And one of the principles that seems to guide this sort of multimodal integration is our causal reasoning principles. So here's some evidence of the role of causal reasoning principles in perception. Let me just say this as a disclaimer. When I say causal reasoning principles, I mean something that can be found in perception. Right? There's some principles about how our perceptual processing unfolds that respects causal relationships. Okay. So here's some evidence of causal reasoning, the way that I'm using it, influencing temporal perception. Perceived simultaneity is facilitated by the plausibility that multimodal or multisensory signals have a common cause to them. So if you've ever watched a movie where the audio and visual tracks are slightly out of line, if it's not a dubbed movie, you kind of get used to it. Right? As long as it's kind of like a short delay, right? It's within a couple hundred milliseconds, you get used to it pretty quickly. But if you've ever watched a movie where the audio and visual tracks are out of line, but it's dubbed, it just seems weird the entire time. Why? Well, the explanation is that if it's a not dubbed movie, it seems like the sounds that you're hearing could come from those mouth movements. But if it's dubbed movie, your perceptual system says, look, those sorts of sounds couldn't come from that sort of mouth. Other ways that causal reasoning principles show up in perception or temporal perception is this sort of well-documented effect that stimuli that are perceived to be related via cause and effect are perceived as occurring closer in time than they actually are. We have this sort of Humean tendency where we want causes and effects to be sort of temporally adjacent to each other. Right? And you can see this in sort of temporal binding effects. Temporal order can also be reversed through cues for cause and effect relationships. Some object A might actually start moving before object B, but if you're given some extra cues that make A seem like the cause of B, you'll see A moving before B. I don't know if I actually said that example right. I think you get it, right? One actually moved before the other one, but you perceive it the other way around due to causal cues, right? Even these trajectory estimation things, the cutaneous rabbit illusion that we discussed, right? Those are also influenced by causal reasoning. If the taps vary and they're sort of like non-temporal qualities, right? One's sharp and the other one isn't sharp, the effect disappears. And since that can't be one rabbit moving up your arm, right? If you're given auditory cues that don't quite line up with the taps, that also diminishes the cutaneous rabbit illusion. Again, there's these sort of, trying to understand the plausible causal structure of the stimuli that's influencing how we perceive the timing of events. Okay. So here's where we start to get this asymmetry. Right. Perception employs these causal reasoning principles from the outset that give a priority to causes occurring prior to their effects. The claim here is that causes typically perceive their effects. There's some illusions that are kind of peculiar where people will actually have an experience of an effect occurring before the cause. And we can talk about those. But I actually think that those are nice cases that reinforce this idea that causal reasoning principles being active in perception. So let's see how these things come together. So from the cutaneous rabbit illusion case, the sort of general trajectory estimation picture, we get this idea that perception represents more than a single moment in time. But notice, simply representing a trajectory isn't enough to explain your capacity for temporal coordination. It's not enough to explain how you're able to act in the world. If the perceptual system sort of representing the trajectory of a ball moving through the air, representing the entirety of the trajectory isn't going to tell you where to move your hand to grab the ball. Why? Because as we saw this in the cutaneous rabbit illusion, some of this trajectory that's being represented is in the past. Some of it's in the future. So somehow, for this sort of trajectory representation to guide behavior in an appropriate way, it has to distinguish between those aspects of the trajectory that you can affect, that you can intervene on. Where can you move your hand to catch the ball from those aspects of the trajectory that are outside of your causal control? So here's, looking at what perception does for us. The way that our perceptual systems seem to work in order to bring about this temporal coordination seems to involve representing the world as being asymmetrically structured in the ways that I was describing earlier, and marks the distinction between those events that you can causally intervene on and those events that you can't causally intervene on. So I think this is pretty much what I just said. Perception needs to coordinate our actions with the environment. Perceptual systems go beyond representing a single moment. They flexibly represent things as standing in earlier than, later than relations or simultaneity relations. And the sequence must distinguish between past and future in order to properly guide behavior and action. So I take these things together to indicate that perception presents us with time as being linearly structured. In some way, this distinctiveness claim is false. You understood distinctiveness in terms of sort of like qualitative difference. There are just some features that are just completely absent from perception. So if the dependency thesis is true, then it's not true due to a simple interpretation of the distinctiveness thesis. Right? If there's still something distinctive about how time is presented to us in episodic memory versus how it's presented to in perception that explains the dependency thesis, well, the onus is on the defenders of the dependency thesis to now point that out. This is kind of a more extreme way of putting it. There's no qualitative distinction between how time is presented to us as linearly structured in perception or memory. So what does that mean about cognitive development? Well, it could mean there's all sorts of open positions here right now. That maybe the development of temporal cognition did depend on our episodic or long-term memory capacities, the way that certain people thought of it. And importantly, those arguments, I should have said this earlier, those arguments for the dependency thesis aren't just from philosophers. I mentioned a few philosophers here, but you see it all over the place in psychology and neuroscience. Okay. So that might not be the way of explaining temporal cognition, development. Does it come from perception? Maybe, right? Another option is that we revisit some of the arguments that have been given against nativism in the field. So people have often pointed to these developmental difficulties that children have with acquiring a mastery of temporal task or temporal language as evidence that nativism about time has to be false. Okay? But maybe this is something that that's it.